He made the world laugh, but he rarely smiled when the cameras stopped. The spotlight burned across his face, turning his features into the same expression everyone knew. The raised eyebrow, the crooked grin, the helpless charm. The crowd's laughter rolled over him in waves, louder than the orchestra, steadier than the applause. He stood there motionless, every detail of the moment rehearsed, except the look in his eyes. Behind that grin was exhaustion. Behind that silence was fear. And somewhere beneath the noise of his own success, something had quietly broken. They called it his greatest performance. He called it just another show. But that night, while millions watched him on screen, no one noticed the tremor in his hands. No one saw the man holding back more than lines. The smile that built an empire was beginning to slip. And once it did, the truth beneath it would change everything. He made the world laugh, but it was laughter that nearly destroyed him. If this story reached you, where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and let's see how far legends still travel. It was late evening in Los Angeles. The studio lights stayed on long after filming ended. Inside, the soundstage smelled of smoke, dust, and sweat, the kind of silence that only follows laughter. Technicians moved through the shadows, packing up cables and props. The director's chair sat empty, and at the center of the set, Chaplin stood alone. He was still in costume, hat tilted, cane resting against his leg. The last take had gone perfectly. Every frame had landed exactly as planned. The crew had already celebrated. But he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even take off the hat. For a few seconds, the camera kept rolling, then stopped. And yet, he stayed frozen in character, as if the applause that once came after each scene had stopped existing. But something in the air had shifted. Outside the studio gates, the crowd still waited for him. Reporters with flashbulbs, fans shouting his name. Even in the dark, the smile they expected felt rehearsed, like part of the costume. He walked past them quietly, signing a few photos without looking up. The laughter outside the fence didn't match the silence inside him. To them, he was the man who could turn pain into comedy. To him, the act had stopped being funny. He waved one last time before the car door closed. The cheers softened behind glass. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, and exhaled the kind of breath that comes after pretending too long. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning. The next morning, filming resumed like nothing had happened. New set, new crew, same routine. Every line rehearsed, every expression planned. The cameras loved him, the world still did. But beneath the lights, small cracks had begun to show. He flubbed takes he'd mastered for years, forgot cues he'd written himself. When he laughed, it came a second late, as if waiting for permission. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody dared. He still looked like Chaplin, the hat, the walk, the smile. But something in the rhythm was off. It wasn't failure. It was fatigue, the kind that hides behind perfection. The laughter still came, but it no longer reached him. Between scenes, he sat in silence, tapping the edge of his cane. The studio air was heavy with heat and dust. Makeup melted under the lights. Assistants whispered from a distance, unsure if they should interrupt. He debuilt a world from motion, from energy, speed, chaos. Now every movement felt measured, every gesture slower than before. The silence between laughs was starting to grow longer, and for the first time, he didn't try to fill it. It looked normal, that's what made it dangerous. That night, he stayed behind again. Everyone else had gone home. The set lights hummed faintly, casting long shadows across the painted streets of his make-believe world. He walked through it slowly, past the cardboard houses, past the prop lamppost, past the mark on the floor where he'd fallen 1,000 times for the camera. Each step echoed louder than it should have. Each reflection in the window looked a little less familiar. At the far end of the stage, he stopped, the hat in his hand, the smile gone. He stood there for a long time, watching the empty space where laughter used to live. No one else saw it, but that was the night his famous smile stopped being a mask and started becoming a memory. The cameras were already rolling. The set lights flooded the room in gold. He stood at the center, hat tilted, cane resting loosely in his hand. Every eye on the stage was fixed on him. Action! He took his mark. A single beat of silence passed before he moved, slow, deliberate, precise. The same stumble, the same grin, the same rhythm that had built an empire. Only this time, something about it felt heavier. The laughter came late, a second slower than usual. Even the director noticed. But the scene continued. He didn't re-character, didn't speak, didn't blink. What looked like performance was really control. And control was slipping. He lifted the cane, spun it once, and missed the landing by inches. The prop hit the ground. It was small, no one else would have cared. But he froze. The sound echoed, a thin clatter that seemed to last longer than it should have. No one moved to pick it up. The crew watched him quietly, waiting for the cue to cut. It didn't come. He bent down, retrieved the cane, and reset himself. No apology, no expression. He went again, repeating the take from the start. The laughter didn't return this time. But something had already changed. Half an hour later, the cameras still rolled. Each take identical, each one slightly less alive than the last. The director whispered something to his assistant, something about lighting, not him. He overheard it anyway. He asked for a break. The room went still. The crew dispersed, unsure if they should leave or stay. He remained by the set door, staring at the floorboards beneath his shoes. The same marks scratched into the wood from years of performance. Same circles, same footprints, worn deeper every day. He rubbed his hands together once, as if trying to shake something off that wouldn't leave. A prop assistant walked over, adjusting his hat, reminding him that the next shot was ready. He didn't respond. When the cameras started again, he didn't enter from his cue. The music played. The extras moved. The world went on without him. And for the first time, Charlie Chaplin missed his own entrance. The soundstage fell silent. The orchestra stopped mid-bar. All eyes turned to the archway he should have appeared from. The director called out, gentle, uncertain, "Charlie." No answer. He appeared 30 seconds later, slower, deliberate, out of breath. He walked straight into the light. Without the hat, without the grin. "I can't do it today," he said. No one moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He turned, left the frame, and walked off set. His footsteps echoed down the corridor until the sound disappeared. No one chased him. No one knew if they should. It was the quietest exit he had ever made. Outside, the sky had dimmed. A breeze moved across the empty studio lot, carrying faint noise from the city beyond the gates. He walked until the lights of the stage were out of sight. The pavement beneath his shoes clicked softly, a rhythm he'd once used to make the world laugh. Now it only marked distance. He stopped beside a parked car, leaned against it, and pressed his hand to his face. No tears, no expression, just stillness. He had performed exhaustion so many times, but never quite like this. Back inside, the crew began packing up. No one said much. A few smiled awkwardly, hoping it was just fatigue. The director watched the playback one last time. In it, Chaplin stands in perfect frame, still smiling, still composed, and then suddenly stops mid-motion, as if realizing in real time that the performance was over. He rewound the reel twice. It always ended the same way, with that half-smile that didn't look like acting anymore. He didn't know it yet, but history had just turned. That night the studio closed earlier than usual. No one stayed behind to rewatch the footage. The laughter that normally filled the corridors was replaced by footsteps. Doors closing, lights going dark. In the corner of the sound stage, the prop cane lay where he dropped it earlier. No one picked it up. The air felt heavier than it should have, almost respectful. When the night guard walked through hours later, he paused at the empty set. The fake street, the lamppost, the mark on the floor. He didn't know what had happened there, but he could tell something had. Somewhere across the city, Chaplin sat alone in his dressing room, hands clasped, still in costume. The mirror reflected the man the world knew. The grin, the eyes, the charm. He looked at it for a long time, then reached forward and turned the mirror face down. He didn't say a word. Didn't need to. When the room finally went dark, the last thing visible was the edge of his smile, faint, tired, and breaking. The cameras never saw that part. The cameras were back on. The next morning looked like every other one. Crew in position, lights balanced, the same mark taped to the floor. He stepped into frame. The room broke into quiet applause. Someone called out, "The master's back." He nodded once and took his place beneath the spotlight. For a moment, it looked like everything was working again. He raised the cane, paused, waited for the cue. When it came, the movement was perfect, effortless, sharp, familiar. Laughter filled the set, echoing through the rafters. The sound was right, but the rhythm was. The applause hadn't stopped, but it didn't sound the same. Between takes, he walked alone, hands behind his back, head slightly lowered. The crew spoke softly around him, pretending, not to watch. He smiled when spoken to, always with precision. But the eyes that followed the smile looked elsewhere, somewhere past the stage, past the laughter. It was as if the applause reached him, but didn't touch. The sound technician noted his silence between shots. The costume assistant asked if he was all right. He said he was and kept walking, but something in him had already changed. The newspapers printed his return as triumph. Headlines called it a master at work again. Publications ran photos of the set, bright lights, perfect form, confident smile. None mentioned the extra time between takes. None mentioned how often he sat down now. The world saw precision. Those near him saw pause. The illusion held, but only because no one dared to look too closely. He rehearsed in front of a mirror again that night. No camera, no audience, just the echo of his own movements. Each gesture followed another like clockwork. But by the 10th repetition, he stopped. His hand trembled slightly, resting against the mirror's edge. He steadied it and started again. Only this time, the smile arrived a second too late. What looked like calm was actually surrender. By the 3rd week of filming, fatigue had crept into routine. The crew adjusted their pace to match his. Nobody complained, nobody asked questions, but eyes began to meet quietly behind the monitors. Assistants whispered off, said about the takes growing slower. The laughter cues didn't land the way they used to. He noticed it too, though he never said so. During lunch breaks, he stayed on set, watching old reels projected against the back wall. There in black and white, a younger man moved without effort. Every movement alive, every beat perfect. He watched for a long time, until the reel spun to its end, flapping soundlessly in the projector. Critics began to write about decline. The word appeared in headlines more often than genius. For the first time, applause felt like history repeating itself. Not admiration, but remembrance. And yet, every day, he still showed up. Still performed the same way. As if holding the image steady could keep the truth from showing through. But the cracks were visible now. Even in silence. On set, the laughter began to sound rehearsed. Extras forced smiles between takes. Even the camera operators avoided meeting his eye. He noticed. They all knew he noticed. The only sound that seemed real anymore was the clapperboard, the sharp snap before every take, the reminder that something had started and would eventually have to end. He held on to that sound longer than the laughter. One afternoon, during a scene rehearsal, he stopped mid-movement and looked straight into the camera lens. The crew froze. He didn't break character, didn't speak, just stared, still smiling. The director let the take run. No one dared to call cut. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and then finally he turned away. It looked like acting. It didn't feel like it. That evening, as the studio emptied, he stood alone under the stage light, looking at the painted backdrop. A city street frozen mid-laughter, crowds forever smiling, faces that would never age. He stayed there longer than usual. The sound of distant footsteps echoed from the hallway. He didn't move. The next morning, the studio gate guard found him already waiting outside before dawn. No driver, no entourage. Just him, coat buttoned tight, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the lot. He entered without a word. The day's shoot never happened. He asked the crew to take the day off. Told them he needed time to think about the next scene. He walked the empty stage once, from one end to the other. Stopped at his mark. There in the silence he smiled again. Not for the cameras. Not for the audience. For something only he seemed to understand. Then he turned, left the stage light on, and walked out. He never performed that scene again. The set remained standing for weeks, untouched, unlit. People passed by it in silence, unsure whether it was waiting for him to return, or whether it had become something else entirely. A reminder, a warning, an ending no one wanted to name. When they finally struck the set, the crew found his cane still leaning against a wall, right beside his mark on the floor. It stayed there for a moment before someone quietly placed it in storage. No one said a word. The cameras moved on to other stories, but something about that room stayed still. It was the place where performance had turned into truth, and no one noticed until it was already too late. The letter arrived just after sunrise. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a short notice from the studio. Production paused, indefinitely. He read it twice, folded it once and set it on the table. Then he walked outside. The air was cold still, almost too quiet for that hour. Even the garden seemed unsure whether to move. But the silence was only beginning. Calls from the press came first, then from lawyers, then from people who used to start their sentences with "friend." The headlines changed tone overnight. Words like "brilliant" were replaced with "controversial." Every photo and print now looked like a statement. He stopped answering the phone, stopped leaving the gate open. The mail piled up in the hallway, unopened. The same world that once waited for his next laugh now waited for an apology he never gave. Meetings were canceled without notice. Contracts quietly shelved. Invitations stopped coming. At first, the silence was professional. Then it became personal. Neighbors waved less. Reporters parked farther down the road, watching from a distance. He still kept a routine. Coffee at 6, walk at 7. But the streets he once turned into a stage now barely looked back. It was as if the whole world exhaled and forgot to breathe him in again. Inside the house, dust began to gather. Papers spread across his desk, half-written notes, unfinished sketches, dialogue fragments. He still picked them up from time to time, then put them back in the same place. The curtains stayed drawn, the piano untouched. The walls, once filled with laughter, had grown still. Even the clock seemed slower here. The studio sent another letter. Final this time. It thanked him for his contribution. No signature. He didn't react. He just placed it beside the first envelope, the same corner of the same table. Then he turned away, as if leaving it there meant leaving it behind. But some things don't stay where you put them. Outside, the season shifted. Leaves gathered on the driveway, undisturbed. Footsteps stopped marking the path between his house and the gate. The world moved on, quietly erasing the edges of his name from its headlines. He started spending mornings by the window, just watching. Children passed by on their way to school, laughing, running, unbothered. Once in a while, one would glance toward the house, as if sensing the faint echo of something they didn't recognize, and then keep walking. Reporters eventually stopped waiting. Papers stopped calling. The silence became permanent. Inside, he adjusted to it. No resistance, no defense, just stillness. He stopped defending the image everyone remembered, stopped performing even in private. The cane stayed on the rack, the hat on its hook. Every symbol of the man the world loved was now just an object in a quiet room. The few visitors who came noticed small changes, fewer photos on the walls, fewer stories shared. The laughter they expected didn't come. Instead, there was order, routine, a man who had finally stopped trying to be understood. And for the first time in years, he looked content, not happy, not healed, just still. The silence had become his company. Once an old colleague dropped by unannounced. He found him reading by the window, sunlight on his face, no radio, no sound. They spoke for a few minutes, about nothing specific. Then came a pause, the kind that feels full but says nothing. When the guest left, he stayed in the same seat for hours, watching the light fade across the floor. He didn't move until the room turned dark. By the time the world started to mention his name again, it wasn't in gossip columns or reviews. It was in retrospective lists, conversations about what once was. He never joined those conversations. He didn't need to. He knew the sound of being remembered from a distance. It never matched the sound of being known. And so he let it pass. Years had slowed into pattern, routine into rhythm. Mornings began the same, ended the same. He wrote sometimes notes, ideas, fragments of scenes. But he never finished them. Maybe he didn't have to anymore. Outside, the garden he planted had grown wild. Untrimmed hedges, flowers blooming without order. Nature had started reclaiming what he once controlled frame by frame. He didn't stop it. Acceptance didn't arrive with words. It arrived with silence, a long, unbroken stretch of it that felt less like punishment and more like peace. He no longer tried to fill it, no longer searched for applause hidden in conversation. He just existed inside the stillness he once feared. This was what remained when the laughter was gone. Not emptiness, just quiet. When the cameras finally came back, it wasn't for a film. It was for a documentary. A crew revisiting history. An old house. A story people thought they already knew. He let them in, walked them through the rooms, showed them where things used to be. And when one of them asked what he missed most, he didn't answer. He just smiled. The same smile the world once thought it understood. By the time they left, the sun had dropped below the horizon. The house looked almost empty now, light fading through the windows, dust visible in the last beam of the day. He stood by the doorway, watching them drive off, then turned, closed the door behind him, and let the silence return. It stayed there, calm, endless, unbroken, a sound only he could hear. And in that quiet, everything he'd ever said without words finally made sense. The studio lights went dark. The cameras stopped rolling. For a moment, the room stayed exactly as it was, as if time itself refused to move forward. No one spoke. Crew members shuffled their notes, avoiding each other's eyes. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway, and somewhere in that still air, the last trace of his laughter hung, fading. It wasn't a dramatic ending, just a quiet one, the kind that arrives so softly, it feels like it had always been there. But silence can be louder than applause. Outside the studio, life went on. Cars passed, papers printed. The story spread before anyone had a chance to decide what it meant. Some called it exhaustion. Others called it arrogance. No one seemed to agree, but everyone had something to say. Headlines turned it into myth before the dust had settled. Clips replayed on newsreels, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Every gesture became a clue. Every pause a confession. But the truth was quieter than any of them imagined. Weeks passed. The noise of the world moved somewhere else, and what remained of that day began to shrink. Not in importance, but in clarity. People stopped debating. They just remembered the image. A man standing in front of a crowd, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's how moments turn into history, not by what's said, but by what's left unsaid. The ripple spread in quieter ways. In interviews, in conversations between strangers who never met him, in writers who used that single expression to define an entire era of fame. Film students studied the footage, pausing on the same frame over and over. That half second before the smile faded, the precise point where performance and truth touched, then broke apart. No one ever found the line between them. In time, the debate disappeared. But the image didn't. It lingered not as scandal, but as a kind of unanswered question. What does it take to make the world laugh? When you've stopped laughing yourself? The question remained long after the story ended. It passed through generations, retold by people who were never there, each retelling quieter than the last. History remembered the moment differently each time. Decades later, the clip resurfaced again. Restored, re-uploaded, remixed for a new audience. Millions watched it without context. They saw only the smile, not what came before, not what followed. Comments filled the space where silence used to be. Some saw genius, others saw pain. But neither was wrong, because the truth wasn't in the smile itself. It was in the pause that followed it. Over time, meaning replaced memory. The image became something larger, a shorthand for the price of performance, for the distance between what's shown and what's felt. The original moment, small, fragile, human, was buried beneath decades of interpretation. And yet the silence beneath it never changed. It stayed intact, untouched by headlines or history, a quiet echo in the middle of all that noise. The studios he once filled with sound now stand empty. Their walls hold no laughter, only the faint hum of air. The stages still exist, but the world that built them does not. Visitors walk through with cameras, filming the empty floors where he once stood. They speak softly, as if loud voices might disturb something sacred. No one knows why, but every room feels like it's listening. At the archive, a reel still sits on a shelf, a film canister labeled only with a date. Inside it, the moment preserved in silence. No commentary, no edits, no explanations. When played, it looks ordinary, a performance like any other. Until it is. Until the smile holds just 1 second too long. Until that second becomes the story. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Years pass in quiet succession. The noise of the world changes faces, but that one image remains. Untouched, unchallenged, still echoing somewhere between art and truth. Some call it performance, some call it confession, but it doesn't matter what it's called anymore. Its meaning lives in silence, and silence doesn't explain itself. Now, when people watch that clip, they don't see the man. They see the moment, the small, fragile proof that even legends blink between takes. No one expected it to last this long. But that's the irony of performance. What was meant to disappear after applause can outlive the applause itself. And so the world keeps watching, not for answers, but for something in that half second that still feels alive. Time has stripped everything else away. The fame, the scandal, the noise, but left behind a silence that refuses to fade. That's what remains now. Not the smile, not the pain, just the stillness between them. In the end, there's no music, no closing line, just a frame frozen mid-laughter, the echo of a smile suspended in high story. The projector keeps spinning. The light flickers. The film ends. But the silence stays. It always does.